Grace and peace, brothers and sisters. It's great to be with you all again. We're going to keep going through First Corinthians. If you haven't, or if you're just joining us around this passage, we have been going through week by week in line with our Soma Federal Way teaching series that we're calling the Future Present. And so I think we're at week 9 or 10 right now. And so these are designed to supplement the sermon series because we're doing online teaching in our house-to-house gatherings. We're trying to keep them to 20 minutes, and there's so much richness in the text itself. So I'm wanting to take some extra time, whether you're a missional community leader and you're wanting to really come prepared to your house-to-house gathering, or you're just wanting to dive a little bit deeper into the text. This time is designed to do that. So we are now finding ourselves in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And this, in ways, marks a transition in the book as a whole. Now, he's still in the middle of establishing them or strengthening them when it comes to their understanding of their morality. As we'll see, he's going to be continually correcting them in the areas where they need correction. But now he starts to address specific things that they have written to him about. This, as we've talked about, what we call First Corinthians is not the first written correspondence between the Corinthian church and Paul. So it's what we have. And so this is now his writing back into what they have written to him. What we have as Second Corinthians is actually, there's another one in between that kind of went south. And so while we're not going to talk about that, there's a continual back and forth. Paul's using his ministers of the gospel, his apostolic team, to deliver letters to various churches, writing in response to what's happening. He's getting word wherever he is at the time. And so this marks a transition in what's happening. And so we see that in verse 1. Now, in response to the matters you wrote about. Now, before we dive into the text, I want to let you know I am using a different translation than I typically do. I typically use the ESV, and in previous weeks, I've used the NASB, or the New American Standard. They tend to be more word for word. However, in my study, I came to discover that the ESV, and we'll see in a second, used some translation that in our culture brings about a different understanding than I think was actually happening in the text. And so this is the CSB, which is also called the Christian Standard Bible. It used to be called the HCSB, the Holman Christian Standard Bible. So just so you have an understanding, it may sound a little different. So now in response to you, and so here we are, the first thing. It's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Pause. This is the third time, I believe, that Paul has quoted them. So this is not him saying his opinion. This is him saying something that they have said to him. And so to have sexual relations, it literally is translated to touch. It's not good to touch a woman. And so that's a euphemism for having sex with, okay? So just so you know, this is going to be a little PG-13 in some cases, but we could be able to handle that. So he responds, but, and this is why we believe that it is a quotation from them, but because sexual immorality is so common, each man should have sexual relationship with his own wife, and each woman should have sexual relations with her own husband. So pause. This is where I think the ESV gets it wrong. They in this one, but because sexual morality is so common, they talk about temptations. They talk about sexual temptations. In the Greek, it literally says, but because of the immoralities. And so, excuse me, this is, it's commonly understood in that time that the immoralities were common in their day. This isn't something that they were tempted to. This is something that was actually happening on a very common basis. And so Paul is saying, hey, there are a lot of people engaged in sexual immorality in the church. Now, we have experienced this already. You have a man sleeping with his mother-in-law. you see in chapter 6 a lot of different sexual morality taking place. And so he's saying, hey, because of all the immorality, and because I like how it says it is so common, he gives them an answer. And what is it? The sexual relationships should be a man with his own wife and a wife with her own husband. Okay. Now, traditionally, um, the translations have each man should have his own wife and each woman should have her own husband. The term have is a euphemism for for having sex, but that didn't translate well when you just to have a woman or to have a wife or to have a husband. And so what churches were doing is they were going and saying, hey, it says that a wife should have a woman should have a husband and a man should have a wife, without realizing that what's happening in the context is people were going outside of their marriage relationships to fulfill their sexual desires. And so Paul is saying, no, you should be having those sexual desires fulfilled in your marriage relationship. Okay. We talk in the sermon, and so I'm not going to talk too much about it. The goal of sex in a marriage relationship is not just to satisfy our cravings, although Paul definitely affirms that that is a need. So instead of just only focusing on that portion, we need to understand that the purpose of sex is to build and develop intimacy in a marriage relationship. That intimacy ultimately proclaims the gospel based on Ephesians 21 through 33 and Revelation 21 to 22, talking about the wedding feast of the Lamb. Okay. The purpose of marriage is to proclaim the gospel, and within it is to experience the level of intimacy that only marriage and sex is able to provide. Now, we will talk about singleness. As we'll see, Paul himself is single. It's good to be single in his eyes. Jesus was single. Jesus never had sex. So sex is not necessary to be human. But in this context, this is how he's addressing this church. So then from there, he goes to make this radical statement. But pause for a second. Chapter 6 is talking about the common immoralities that's happening within the church. He has a couple different lists, right? Chapter 7 is the people on the opposite end of the spectrum. These are people that are more in line with what's called asceticism, where they are refraining from any form of sexual relationship. Now, behind this, and we talked about this last week, there is a group of people that have been influenced by Gnostic theology. Gnosticism is the belief that there is a special spiritual wisdom. And once you attain that spiritual wisdom, then you have it's dualistic. You separate the body and the spirit. And because in the Gnosticism theology, spirit is good, physical body is bad. So these people that believe they've attained a spiritual wisdom, because in this case, they were speaking in tongues and they had spiritual power, these people were refraining from having sexual relationships in their marriages. That resulted in those people, and these were actually, in this case, women refraining from having sex. They were what some theologians called eschatological women. They were refraining from sex with their husbands, and so the husbands were going and sleeping with prostitutes. And so Paul is having to walk this fine line. You have a group of people that are engaged in all types of sexual immorality, but you also have this group of people that are completely refraining from any form of sex, even within the confines of what God has designed in a husband and wife covenant marriage. So he has to walk this line and trying to establish them and giving them a bigger picture. So this is how he does it. Verse 3, a husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise a wife to her husband. A wife does not have the right over her own body, but her husband does. In the same way, a husband does not have the right over his own body, but his wife does. Okay, pause for a second. For us, we can hear this in our day as Paul, and we see a lot of times how this has been taken out of context and used as a patriarchal domination of women. You have a man who has a sexual desire, and this is traditionally, this is not biblical. This is what's happening in our day. A man has a sexual desires, and he uses this. Hey, I own you. It's like using Ephesians 5. I'm your head. You are to do what I say. See, a woman should fulfill her marital duty to her husband. Okay, we look at it from that perspective. And this passage has been abused. People have gone with this and say, hey, my wife's body is mine. And this also feeds into this idea that sex is primarily for the man and it is more dutiful for the woman. But that is not what this passage is talking about. Notice the mutual expression of both of this. What you have, a marital duty is both husband and wife, and you have ownership of both husband and wife. In this day, for Corinth, this is preposterous. The idea that a wife has a right over her husband's body was scandalous in ways. Biblically, it's beautiful, but culturally, it's scandalous because a husband, divorce is what we're going to talk about in a minute, especially in upper class families, was very common. There was marriage and giving, and there was divorce all throughout. A husband could just simply write a certificate of divorce, whether it was that she wasn't fulfilling his sexual desires or he just wanted to go somewhere else. There was a very, very low bar for reasons for getting a divorce. And what Paul is saying here is that is mutual between husband and wife. That's not just husband over wife. Regarding sexual desire, if you look at Songs of Solomon, which is it is about intimacy between a husband and a wife. It was commonly read. And now it goes beyond that in saying how sexual relationship is about intimacy, but it is revolving around that. In that, the woman is the pursuer of sexual relationships. And so we can't say men pursue, women just receive. Men desire, women have duty. That's not even biblical. That's a cultural expression in our day, but that's not a biblical thing, okay? And so notice the mutuality. Notice the how it's one another. They both have duties for one another to fulfill their sexual desires and cravings, which, as we talk about in the sermon, is a picture of biblical intimacy and desire there, but also in our bodies for one another. A husband and wife, their bodies belong to one another, okay? So, and this is where he goes. He says, do not deprive one another. This deprive is also used in chapter 6 in regarding lawsuits about defrauding. This has the connotation of like, hey, you have ownership or you have something that is rightfully yours. Don't steal it from one another, okay? So don't deprive one another sexually, except when you agree. So 2 caveats. This needs to be agreed upon. One person can't determine when or not. Now, because it's mutual, this is within the context of a relationship where both partners are seeking the benefit of one another, okay? The husband's laying down his life as Christ has laid down his life for the church, and the wife is respecting her husband, okay? So there's mutual service taking place here in the midst of the headship and order that God has designed within the family. Okay. So, but this is in essence saying sex is not a negotiating tool. I can't lord this over you like, hey, I want you to do something for me. I'm going to hold off sex until that happens. That's not what Paul is saying here. He's saying when you agree, that's when you can say no, and also for a time. And he says, for the purpose of devoting yourselves to prayer, it could be prayer and fasting, it could be speaking specifically towards something, whatever the cause may be. To say no together is agreed upon, and it's for a time. Why? He says, then come together again. What does that mean? That's talking about sex. It's not just saying, hey, you go and pray in your own mountain, come back together and talk about it. He's talking about sexual relationships here. Otherwise, Satan may tempt you because of your lack of control. I say this, now this is really important. We're going to see this throughout the rest of the passage. I say this as a concession, not as a command. So Paul here, and we'll see this throughout, he's speaking about spiritual guidance and wisdom, not spiritual commandments. This is a leader that's coming into a messy situation and trying to figure out how to help them take their next step towards living in line with the gospel. Now, there are commands here. There are norms. And he's also trying to get them to understand that where they are and where they should be is different. And he's trying to bring them there. And he says this amazing thing, verse 7, I wish all people were as I am. This I am, it's commonly understood, and elsewhere when Paul talks this is coming up in chapter 9, Paul talks about his rights as an apostle. He has a right to be paid for the work that he's doing. And he uses this metaphor of Caiaphas and the other apostles, and he says, don't they have a right with their wives to be taken care of? But Paul is not married. This I am is talking about his singleness. Now, here's the amazing thing. Paul was a Pharisee. Pharisees got married. That was a very common. I don't know if there are cases where there are Pharisees that were unmarried. That was part of it. So what happened? It's commonly understood that Paul was once married. This isn't as I am currently in the present. This is as I always have been. So we don't know what happened to Paul's wife. There's very, very good arguments to believe that he's actually a widower, that he had a wife and then she died. We can see that coming up in the rest of this passage, the second part of it, that he was married to somebody that was not a professing Christian. And so it could be perceived that she left him. She did not want to continue in that marriage relationship. Okay. We don't know. It's all speculation. But it is clear that Paul has and he even says it, verse 7, each has, I wish that all people were as I am, but each person has his own gift from God. This is the same word for spiritual gift. One person has this gift, another has that. We'll see a lot more of that in chapter 12. So we know he's single. We don't know why he's single. Is he a widower? Is he, did somebody leave him? We don't know, but he does have a desire for people to be married, to be single, but he also doesn't neglect the needs for people that have a desire to be married. Okay. So he even talks about, like I said, he talked about Caiaphas. He doesn't neglect that, but he does go on to talk about singleness pretty thoroughly about how that frees him to serve the Lord. We'll talk more about that next week, and that happens later in this chapter. Okay. So where I'm going now, I was not able to address in our sermon, so this takes more into account. So verse 8, now he starts to address specific groups of people. I say to the unmarried, this literally means demarried, A lot of people understand this to be widows or widowers. That Greek word for widower was not in the Koine Greek, which was the Greek that the New Testament was written in. It was the term widower was not available to Paul at that time. That was a later word. So he didn't have that term in his lexicon or in his vocabulary. So he had this term unmarried, but it likely means widower. And this is what he says to them. It is good for them to remain as I am. Okay. Like it's ideal for you to stay where you are. Right now, all of this, we don't have it in this passage, but in verse 26, he talks about what he's talking about in light of the present distress. So we'll talk about it more then, but there's something happening that's specific to Corinth that he's having to apply biblical wisdom into their situation. So it's not necessarily universal, but there are principles that do apply and that are universal. So it's good for them to remain I am, but if they don't have self-control, they should marry. Since it's better to marry than burn. Now, burn with desire. This is actually the only word in the Greek, since it's better to marry than to burn. Now, that used to be in the old translations, but that has the connotation of hell. People kind of went there like, hey, you have these sexual desires. If you fulfill them, you're going to burn in hell. What it actually means is to be consumed with the desire, and that being burning with that desire will lead you towards utilizing your sexual desires outside of the way it's meant to be. So if you're unable to, it's better to marry because it's worse to burn with desire. Okay. So he addresses the widows and widowers in verse 8 and 9. Then he goes and he returns to the married. And he says, look, notice this, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. This is a really unique language that is in this chapter that Paul doesn't seem to use elsewhere. He's really being really clear, like, hey, there are certain things that is commanded from God. What is it here? A wife is to not leave her husband. He's talking about divorce. The ideal that the Lord has commanded is a wife is to not leave or divorce her husband. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And the same way, a husband is not to divorce his wife. So the command here, the norm, the rule is divorce is a no-no. Now, we do know that, and we'll see in a second, that are caveats to this. Even Jesus himself, he says, unless it's for sexual immorality. When the bond of covenant is broken by having sex outside of that covenant relationship, that Jesus has what I'll call a pastoral accommodation to that. Is it ideal? Is it the norm? No. But the scriptures have such a high view of marriage that divorce is the last effort. And we even see in this passage a desire towards reconciliation. She should be reconciled to her husband, and I'll say vice versa. That in hard marriage relationships, the desire, what should be pursued, is reconciliation. It's not always an option, but that should be the desire. Okay. And now Paul switches. That was a command from God, he's saying. But now he, not the Lord, he wants to say to the rest of everybody else, if any brother has an unbelieving wife. Now, this rest are the rest of those that are married. Okay. He's going to talk about singles and people that are engaged in the next portion. But to the rest of those that are married, he gives this recommendation, this guidance, this apostolic wisdom. If any brother has an unbelieving wife and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. Same idea with also, if any woman has an unbelieving husband and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce her husband. Notice the same thing for husband and wife. For the unbelieving husband is made holy by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Wait a second. This is a lot going on here, okay? So this accommodation, now remember, this is like early church. They're just getting saved. They're just hearing the gospel. He's saying that sometimes when people were getting saved, that the whole household did not get saved as well. Sometimes a wife did and a husband did not. Sometimes a husband did, but a wife did not. So what do you do in that situation? How does marriage apply to this? Okay, what does sex look like in this environment? Paul says the one to pursue divorce should not be the believing partner. Why? Because for all you know, verse 16, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife. That's what it means by this holy language. They are secondarily being benefited by somebody who's living according to the way God designed the world. Because their partner is saved, there is a likelihood that they could be saved. Now, it's not saying that if you are saved and your spouse isn't, then vicariously through you, that person is saved. That's not what this passage is saying. It's saying that there's a chance that they would be. Likewise, this passage is also used to advocate for paedobaptism or infant baptism. And they use this based on the implication, otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So the implication to this is that because I am a believer, I want to make them holy and clean and show them to live God's ways. They should be baptized to walk in those ways as circumcision was done for children. Now, there are ways in which you can get there from this passage, but that's not what this specific passage is talking about. It's talking about, in the context of Corinth, what is happening in a relationship where one person is saved and one person is not. And likewise with children, what happens with them? If the unbeliever leaves, let him leave. A brother or sister, now notice this is Christian language, okay, is not bound in such cases. God, and notice the goal of all this. God has called you. You're going to see this called language in the rest of the passage about your place, okay? But the goal is to live in peace. That's the goal. And so that's why for all you know, you may save it, okay? The goal in this, and this accommodation that's being made that Paul is giving them guidance towards, is to stay with them. I'm now going to skip ahead to the end of the passage because in the rest of it, it really talks about singleness that we're going to address next week. But here it talks about marriage again. So a wife is bound as long as her husband is living. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to anyone she wants, only in the Lord. This is another Christian. This is counteracting what we just talked about here. If you're going to remarry after your unbelieving spouse dies, make sure it's a Christian. Paul talks about this elsewhere in 2 Corinthians about unequally yoked, the importance of being bound with somebody, intimate with them in a covenant relationship with God as the center and common beliefs is extremely important. So that's what Paul is addressing here. But then he goes on to say this amazing thing. She's happier if she remains as she is, in my opinion. And I think that I also have the Spirit of God. So he's saying, hey, Paul's going to not only accommodate, he's going to advocate for somebody to be single. He thinks that's a good thing. And as we'll see next week, they're able to be free to serve the Lord. Now, it doesn't mean that those of us that are married can't, but there's a different type of freedom that comes when you're unbound by family and responsibilities, duties to husband and wife, as it says here. Okay. But we'll talk about that next week. So Paul's talking about marriage. He's trying to help them establish what sex is like in marriage in this passage, understand what a marriage relationship is be like, how they can serve one another, a mutual relationship, but what it means for this Corinthian church that has people that have or morality on one side and ascetics on the other, people that are having sex with anybody and everyone, and people are not having sex with even the people that they're supposed to. Paul is trying to lead and strengthen the church in that. I hope this serves you well. Comments, like, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and we'll talk to you next week.